Hello everyone, today we talk about the partition of India, right? Triggered, as you know, in the region, de facto war without end, the close of British rule and the clash between two major faiths began, right? This was re-intensified to an unprecedented level at this point in history, for which it's important, of course, to offer a minimal background to that. Recently I made a video about medieval Indian and admittedly also Southeast Asian warfare. It was just a part of a series we will resume. However, we explained especially like the influence of Islamic military culture in the Hindu one. And from there we sort of restart because essentially, like we will talk about this in some more evidential detail. Here we're just introducing it instrumentally to the broader topic. But to make the very long story short, the Islamic incursion into the Indian subcontinent commenced in the 11th century. Right? You can argue that had already been an important influence, especially if you look at certain potentates that had been established in what would become the territory of today's Pakistan, which is also, in fact, the topic of that. But say we will come back at some point also on Eastern Persian or Afghan warfare, because as you know that is very much connected with the Indian one historically from a very long time. We talked about the Indo-Scythians, etc. So that corner of in fact of in between southern, western, central Asia is exactly the point of conjunction of these different identities, different forces that still today, as you know from the news, still bring to that kind of attrition, right? So initially, the Muslim invasion of India was marked by the capture of Lahore. We are in 1021. And Turks of Persian descent as well, because at that point we hardly talk about this, but was also the point that an overlapping of different identities and in fact religions, languages, and ethnicities, hailing from what is today central Afghanistan in particular, wrested control of Delhi, the major center of the Indian subcontinent, from its Hindu rulers in 1192. So it was not like a lightning conquest, but it brought to, as you know, pretty durable consequences. By the way, Afghanistan would be the launching pad also for the Mughal conquest of India. Timur Lane was about to invade China from the same place. So again, we'll come back on all these topics at some point because they're incredibly fascinating. And to make the long story even shorter, by 1323, the Muslims had founded in India a sultanate stretching to Madurai, close to the southern edge of the peninsula as well. Thus, with several other sultanates, by the way, arising from Gujarat in the west to Bengal in the east. So it was a pretty widespread transversal conquest that did follow a pattern in this immense territory and community that, in fact, has many avenues within itself, and today we will not look at. But while the term Islamic is bestowed on this conquest, such label is also, in fact, a modern simplification. Those living at the time described it mostly, for example, like a Turkish conquest. It is also very interesting. Categorized by ethnic and linguistic distinctions rather than religious ones. The conquest was characterized by widespread killings and the destruction of Buddhist and Hindu sacred sites, yet over time India absorbed, as it always happens in her history, and in a way tamed her invaders. This superimposition is also quite fascinating because, as you understand, Islamic faith was important for the conquerors, but there was also a broader legacy that could be felt even as more important as far as the ethnos, right? A Turco-Mongolian origin, a specific lifestyle, and more, that in fact brought mostly some of the wildest Muslims of the year, so some of the most peripheral, some of the most fringe ones, to actually take over this enormous space that instead the sort of more built-up powers installed in other sort of different regional contexts had not really even had the realistic means to achieve. Right, this gives also different, because who were these Muslims at the end of the day? What kind of, like, looking at the 20th century, what kind of implications does this have for the international relations? Skipping a lot, in 1784, I made, if you're interested, a lot of videos about Mughal warfare. So there we also explain these things because, as you know, the Indus kept maintaining actually a very important role in Islamic armies, constituting also some of the finest cavalry next to the one of the invaders, actually as a very sort of a heavier even integration in certain cases, and also a pretty underrated one in its equestrian culture, as I was explaining in other episodes. In 1784, British Prime Minister William Pitt, that we discussed a bit as far as his, global vision, global strategy, in the video about the British military history of the 7 Years' War in Mediterranean and North America. We will continue that series talking about India, obviously enough. Introduced the India Act, which in fact brought the Indian territories managed by the East India Company, a private corporation granted exclusive trading rights with India by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, under governmental supervision. Right? Just yesterday we were talking about Nouvelle France, and so how Canada at some point was nationalized as well, but it's hanking this very similar dynamics. Nevertheless, we never really talked about 18th century Indian warfare, nor about too much about also the same British one there, which of course is a must at this point. We will have to make some videos on this. In any case, within a few decades, the East India Company had solidified its foothold in Bengal and started to overshadow its European rivals, namely the Dutch and the Portuguese, some again of the most successful and aggressive colonizers in their time, especially considering the modest size of their countries, that however in fact could not quite also in the old world much compete against Britain alone. And at this point, in fact, really witnessed the taking off of the British Empire as we understand it, with the East India Company evolving into not just a commercial entity, but also a political force, right? A proxy state on its own that progressively meddled in India's domestic matters as well, right? I will not open the parentheses of how Europeans succeeded in this at large, also in the rest of the world, but this pretty much looked like a dam breaking, maybe in slow motion, but still with the same impetus. By establishing its own military, the company transformed into an empire in its own right, securing Bengal in particular through its triumph at the Battle of Plassey on June the 23rd, 1757, which illustrates also much of the political dynamics of how Europeans themselves managed to succeed in a system that technically had even the potential, like any, right, to resist invasion, conquest, and subjection, but that instead failed at that point. Commanded by Robert Clive, the company's force at Plassey counted 3,000 troops. We're talking, as we've seen in colonial context, also in recent videos in mostly about North America, they're fairly contained forces compared to what was happening on the major battlefields of Europe. Besides, of these 3,000, 2,100 were Indian sepoys, which means soldiers. In the original language, it comes from sipai, right? So it's something we have seen in Islamic armies, especially the Ottoman one a lot, like in the at least ideal soldierly essence of this sort of a bit non-average or random fighter, especially considering like the vast masses that at some point emergentially the Indians could mobilize. There were, however, and most importantly, 800 British regulars, which means like proper professional regimental military that at this point were just like the stone walls, as well as the stormtroopers of the situation across the world with their linear tactics that in open ground wherever, right, there isn't just open ground, especially also in some wild overseas territories, but this was the case. India offered that, and it facing the Nawab of Bengal's 50,000 strong army. The aforementioned sort of put all together kind of Indian style strategy. And naturally, like we will see better in a video dedicated to the Battle of Plassey how this went down, because again, the odds were balanced. It's not like the Indians were incapable, as we were saying before, lacked the opportunity to win. However, leveraging deception, and exactly because of that threat, Clive secured victory through a clandestine alliance with Mir Jafar, the Nawab's disaffected commander, exploiting thus some personal rivalry and jealousy. Of course, Indian power at large was very, as you understand, private and feudal in many aspects. So it was really not much a matter of, again, India versus the world, but see who had power within India rather, because they understood that simply the country could not be cancelled even under more powerful European commanders, so to say. Mir Jafar withheld, in fact, 20,000 troops during the battle from the Bengalese force and fought in a rain-soaked mango grove, which gives you also the picturesque context in which this bloodshed took place. The engagement saw from the British side with fewer than 100 company casualties, against instead 1,000 Bengali losses, which were enough for the Bengalis to desist and for the British to seize control over Bengal's £5 million annual revenue, which would be the equivalent of £500 million in 2025 currency. This victory exemplified the emphasis on winning without prolonged fighting by exploiting enemy divisions, but it also entrenched a British strategy of manipulating local rivalries. So as far as you wonder why we talk about Plassey in this sense, because as far as the partition of India, this in hindsight had become also through a British fostering of the Indo-Islamic tensions that would later erupt in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century. Like the company's subsequent governance prioritized, in fact, profit over unity, deepening regional fractures, setting a colonial precedent for the subcontinent's eventual violent division that we're going to describe today. Right? The British did not immediately take over everything in a uniform fashion. They, of course, took a hold of what was more strategic to directly administrate and basically dominated the rest through different layers of control, of manipulation, through also a gradual subsumption to some more concentrated government. And that's where we get our big jump forward on August the 15th, 1947, after 3 centuries of dominance, when the British withdrew from India for good. The crown jewel of their empire, as India was called, was split, in fact, into 2 sovereign nations. India, in fact, predominantly Hindu, and Pakistan predominantly Islamic. This event is known, in fact, as the Partition. Is perhaps better described, however, some overall brutal severance. Not much because, again, of the British that would have liked to of course, to maintain their empire. It was an incredibly difficult time in their history. We'll see it later. And in fact, much had to do with probably the internal forces to India that had also pushed themselves, of course, for the independence as well for to this partition and bringing it to happen in this incredibly bloody way. In fact, what does happen? Almost immediately, to begin with, one of history's largest mass migrations unfolded, with millions of Muslims carrying only meager belongings journeying toward western and eastern Pakistan, where they had been obliged to move. Eastern Pakistan is what is now called Bangladesh, while millions of Hindus and Sikhs, too, moved instead in the opposite direction, because even though there were less compared to the Muslims in the movement, they also were expelled from these territories where they had inhabited for a very long time, thus causing some of the most disastrous consequences of the 20th century, right? We will talk at some point even about something more specifically genocidal, such as like the Turkish deportation of the Armenians that turned out into an actual massacre. But that much had to do with literally the fact that aside from the Turkish hatred on the Armenians, literally the way these people were actually deported, not simply slaughtered on the spot, were so terrifying that people began to start. I mean, the same Ottomans at the front were basically eating one another because they resorted to cannibalism as food was over. There are some stories from German medics at the front in Mesopotamia that are quite eloquent. Some Armenians came, a few admittedly came safely to the Anatolian heartland where they had been scheduled to be moved, but there is no doubt that the whole proceeding was a way essentially to exterminate the largest part of them. And as you know, this is still not recognized in Turkey, especially. In any case, going back to India, just to say how, also mass society produces like the possibility of enacting such enormous as dysfunctional changes. Communities had, this is the most important thing in my opinion, that had historically coexisted. Right? There is no doubt how uneasily, but still for thousands of years. And now, this shared history itself turned violent against one another in a surge of sectarian bloodshed. Right? Every country has its own vicissitudes, but this is something that we witnessed in Europe as well. Right? And you know how medieval the sense of having different estates, different groups that are like in a corporative hierarchy had brought to what cannot be called as tolerance, at least probably in the contemporary usage of that, because it was not based on that. It was there was a ferocious discrimination in the doctrine of the castes within the same, for example, religions, but even more when, say, the Muslims came to be seen as the conquerors over an Hindu population. Again, everything was very mixed and there were different sects and branches, etc. So you can imagine how messy this was, especially in a country like India. I mean, just think about the demographic size and the extension of the land, and especially in a territory that doesn't matter how civilized by the British, regardless of course, the harsh colonial rule, did not really have much to control. I don't know, even from a documentary point of view, how many people actually disappeared from here and there. It's a problem even during World War II in Central and Eastern Europe, because it's not like, I don't know, in Belarus you have, accounts of how many people live where in a modern sense, like in the 1940s. So God only knows how much was actually lost in this. By the way, we have from the British extremely interesting ethno-anthropological works. As you know, like we studied the Vedas, we studied the Hindu tradition in different aspects. And let's say even the continuity of certain military traditions, of course, modified over time. It's certain particular lives would have been were shattered in this process largely, and or irremediably crippled, like in their manifestation. This happens, like whoever studies anthropology knows that in general, even through modernization, this stuff is lost. And definitely, the partition of India was one of the most graphic sort of examples of these mechanisms. What followed essentially from mostly like categorically like the Islamic and the Hindu perspective was a reciprocal genocide. A genocide that doesn't matter how sudden, had very specific premises that had been hinted at in the years prior, yet still unimaginable in the catastrophic scope that turned out to be experienced. The violence was especially ferocious in Punjab and Bengal, regions divided by the borders with western and eastern Pakistan, because Pakistan, as we've seen, was also Bangladesh. And so obviously the frontier areas, right? You know that India also in the west is less geographically clear. Like you have the Indus, you have like, but aside from the north that has pretty strong mountainous wall, you have in fact the major ways of those peoples that over the centuries, the millennia, had gradually also sort of settled across this territory, straddling important reliefs and natural barriers, but not creating a broader frontier area as opposed to a specific border that did not help at all. In a sense, even the Bengalese separation was arguably even more arbitrary. And this event, and this is a wholly hellish scenario, is marked by massacres, arson, forced conversions, mass kidnappings, and horrific sexual violence. Roughly 75 women were raped, and that we know of. In general, we can estimate possibly there were way more. Many also disfigured or mutilated, right? And an additional 25,000 were abducted, never to reunite with their families, by the way. So this was happening from both sides with quite an important amount of zeal, right? And this tells you also, by the way, like in historical perspective, that the repressed violence that in general these populations, it's not like India had ever been a very peaceful place to begin with. Add on that like the anger of colonization, like all these also disorientation because of like the an independence that had now brought this radical and only apparently Solomonic this distinction of two peoples that were moving their first steps after, in fact, centuries of foreign domination, naturally with all the deficits in civic education and kind of political cohesion and so on. Exiting colonialism, this was also for many like the entire point. As you know, by 1948, when this ghastly slaughter ended with the cessation of migration, because at some point at least most movement did actually succeed in displacing those who had been programmed, more than 15 million people had been moved, and between 1 and 2 in the process had lost their lives. All right. This carnage profoundly shaped the individual and collective identities of the Indian subcontinent, searing them with the enduring trauma of those unspeakable horrors. Like think, okay, India today is the largest country in the world demographically speaking. So you say, well, you know, I don't want to say that, but everybody thinks what they're thinking, like only 1 or 2 million. Like, but at the time, first of all, of course, in proportion to the world, but in general, like for 1 or 2 million dead, you must imagine multiplying in that hands, like going through some of the sheer horror and pain, and even more people being affected by this. So this was something that definitely left horrifying scars in the country and in the countries at this point. So one question historically that, of course, we must tackle is, why did this occur to begin with? So after World War II, Britain, as you know, had lost the palm of greatest world power. I would like to stress, by the way, that with the British victory in the 7 Years' War, Britain literally becomes the strongest power in the world. All right. Before, China had maintained by sheer size the aforementioned palm, but Britain, historically speaking, in the following century especially, was essentially the first global power, and in so many ways that are not just, in fact, quantitative, but also qualitative. And so modernity entails also a faster rise and fall in many ways. And as you know, the gradual loss of the empire was an incredibly painful process within British society. Churchill, in many ways, regardless of his heroic exploit, and yes, I'm saying this because, you know, that there are some people who are watching these videos because they think, so he's the guy who finally says the Churchill was the villain, the Bengal famine, and whatever. I'm not even going to comment on this, and who knows the history, of course, knows why. Had really lost in a broader sense. I mean, the heroic struggle, not just of Churchill, that really stood his ground when, the country was about to literally wanting to capitulate at some point, but also a country that literally instead did stand, that found the force to stand that ground, and basically managing for a couple of years single-handedly, like the greatest stress in Europe against the Axis alone. We'll talk more about British successes. Today, of course, we'll talk about Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten. We last saw in the video about Dieppe that naturally was not one of the brightest, moments in general, but at least, as you know, clamorously distinguished and as famous figure, to say the least, that had a deep involvement also in the partition of India. But Britain at this point, where after World War II and within the Cold War already, was drained and financially crippled. This brought also in, as we know in hindsight, to some specific liberal leaning, incredible social warfare, etc. That set a trend that probably was not particularly helpful, that went actually, as we know, to another excess. And then I really want to talk about the Falkland Wars because of my beloved Margaret, because in that part of my overall myths. But what was happening in the end of the 40s was really one of very incredibly difficult at the same time. Wars, in hindsight, and the crisis that we were still feeling to be facing. For example, especially in the first half of the 80s, right, during the Cold War and beyond. And think about also Mountbatten, as you know, being blown up by the IRA, at least in the late 70s. And we understand how close these decades really are, especially for those who have lived them, and especially in Britain, from that particular perspective, but that are very global, very much shared. Also true, that enormous British legacy that we carry in Western culture. At the time, the country was grappling with and the empire was grappling with a protracted recovery. No longer had the means to govern the most valuable gem of its empire, as India, as of course this immense, continent on its own, had historically represented, also bring into immense cultural influence and revival of also certain an attention to certain traditional aspects like history of religions in the Indo-Europeistics. Also the Germans were very much fixated with Orientalism, so during National Socialism, etc. In any case, at this point, withdrawing from the waning era of colonialism, I started also a series on the Vietnam War. We talked about the Indochina, one in Korea. Was really an urgent necessity to fix this mounting issue. In fact, Britain's departure from India was so much needed that it turned out to be hasty, chaotic, and ultimately poorly planned, which did not really help the general crisis, the general image, and the broader British handling is just much like the vision of India's future. From the cynical perspective of the former colonial power, it was a triumph because at least they had literally disengaged from it. And truly because Britain had at least literally unburdened itself from this Leviathan. And second, because after 3 centuries of rule, punctuated by fierce rebellions, by the way, and harsh suppressions, the British military withdrew in an orderly fashion, right? Without engaging in a war, with only 7 casualties in total for the entirety of the country, which was, in this sense, admittedly a success. This withdrawal, however, was evidently a strategic retreat born of necessity and not much of foresight to begin with. The British Indian Army, which peaked at 2.5 million troops in 1945, was reduced to 390,000 by 1947 due to demobilization, with 14,000 British officers and troops overseeing a force increasingly split by communal loyalties. So in other words, those same soldiers that had served the empire now not just were witnessing, of course, like the independence of their country, but they were literally slipping control of the control of the British. That in this sense were really lucky not to engage, to have this independence turn into a war against themselves. And that, in part, happened because, of course, of the aforementioned divisions within the same population in the military that made it up. Because 40% were Muslim, a half Hindu, and 10% Sikh, right? So there was no moral force essentially to unify these ranks. The army failed to deploy effectively against riots, as of course these were instrumentally used by the various factions. For example, units like the Punjab Boundary Force, we're talking 50,000 troops, were overwhelmed by 200,000 daily violent incidents across 55,000 square miles, right? And as such, even just the manpower could not handle the country overall in itself. The aforementioned 7 British casualties, mostly from stray attacks, by the way, masked a catastrophic failure to secure civilian safety, amplifying the partition's bloodshed and entrenching religious animosities, as well as general hatred towards the British. For the subcontinent, this sudden shift was a catastrophe that continues to evoke horror, as we described before. In fact, it's as if overnight, nearly a millennium of history was obliterated, a period during which the subcontinent's peoples had, despite challenges and conflicts, forged at least a shared, compact culture marked by extensive intermingling and mutual influences. So almost a global model of syncretism of an old time, those that do not exist anymore, like in the sort of ancien regime vision of the world, blending, but even older, even more primal in that sense, blending ideological and religious elements that were obviously, and since the beginning, incompatible, but still driven by the practical need to make the system work. And again, we've seen this well in the video about the Mughal army, right? So actually, these cultures had always been notoriously, the Indian subcontinent, one of the single most traumatically violent one in the history of man. I mean, what happened in those places, just from a local perspective, is something that makes colonialism just being, buff on the cheek, really. This is inherent to their culture. This is intrinsic, right? It's not even just like culturalism taught us to say that, more violent people are simply the barbarians, but this is not quite the same. Yes, wild, unregulated violence, like also the one that broke out at that point, was surely due to the lack of some sort of more virile British iron fist that instead, preferred, as we've seen, not to even be to be taken out of the pocket. But in this massive violence, we can see among all the dysfunctionality of an already actually non-traditional world, still the legacy of millenary traditions that had been cultivating, for example, a military ethos, holy war. Hell, like if you look at the influence of Iranian, in fact the Hindus, like the Vedic origin at least, influences, plus bits of also of Turco-Mongolian, like even sort of complex of later counters. Like you find that atrocious violence is very, very well exemplified also in Indian. If you look at Indo art, for example, is very morphic, so to say. You know how heavy and bloody and bodily, and this sense properly of slaughter that emerges from this hypertrophic system that basically devours and chews itself to regenerate according just to the mostly chthonic at that point cyclical sense of nature. Now, over those centuries, a common Indo-Islamic civilization had objectively taken root. I mean, the history of India in the previous half millennium had fundamentally been about that. This is witnessed by, for example, hybrid languages such as Deccani and Urdu, right, which fused Sanskrit-based dialects with Turkish, Persian, and even Arabic vocabulary. There had been even consistent troops coming from the Horn of Africa that, as you know, we've seen in other videos, a place torn by interreligious warfare between Christians and Muslims. Because you had all kinds of, and again, the system is enormous and always in contact actually with neighbors. Paradoxically, less with China, but with many of us. We've seen with Central, Western Asia, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Of course, wars, often violent and deadly, were ever present. As we were saying before, you can't really say that these were, peaceful populations by any stretch of the imagination, way before any kind of colonization. That, of course, has nothing to do with that, if not for maybe a sense of repressed resentment. But it was in the 2 decades leading up to the partition that relations between these groups that had never fully liked each other deteriorated to the point where coexistence between the two dominant religious groups, in fact, was deemed untenable, rendering the division of the colony in 2 distinct states, each with its own fate, culture, and traditions, for how actually much more multifaceted the aforementioned system had actually been. So we're getting some sort of national statal reality, regardless of the deeply ingrained religious traditions behind that. Like the principle was basically along that pattern, because of course those ideologies, as we will see now, had spread also among less modern secularized cultures, and really unavoidable as an outcome anyway. Because what do you do, right? You can't re-replicate what India had been from millennia. So this was like the fastest, sort of, maybe not laziest, but still definitely the rashest and more straightforward of the solutions. The noble vision of a united India embracing all religions, which had persisted at least, even among the country, until the 1920s, was unrealistic too fragile to survive, especially the collapse of the British governance that had fundamentally succeeded in keeping things together up to that point, but that unity had become a too far stretch even for Albion, which in fact had long encouraged those very political divisions along religious lines to trying to at least divide and conquer, like kind of, but also probably in the context of a more unified administration to clarify who was who, for example, right? Which naturally was very complicated compared to, I don't know, what could have been simply the ethno-cultural homogeneity of Britain at the time, at least. And so the repercussions were now undeniable in the moment in which they took place. The Second World War concluded just 2 years earlier. Imagine this: Europe razed to the ground, the world shattered by the new big competition between the so-called blocs, and in fact, a globe to reorder, with, however, a very scarce amount of resources except from, and will to power in that sense, except the one in the hands of the United States. And so everything was more difficult for, those who had also paid for an important part of the brunt of this war. We mentioned before, like the difficulties, to say the least, that India had to go through to support the empire during World War II. Also, the Indian military service in different fronts of the war, including the heart of Europe. I also made a video about how the Nazis had enlisted some Islamic and Hindu forces. So there were, as we'll see now, also pretty dark forces agitating within politically and ideally. And still like today, for example, Hitler is a very famous person in India today, and a positive one, as a matter of fact. Like in Japan, people do not even know what a swastika is, but in India, for some reason that we could even explain at some point, you have this weird kind of attitude, among many others objective, but this is also another story. In World War II, regardless, of course, of the Allies' victory, had and so of all the dependencies of their empire, the British Empire in this case, had deepened the rifts between the colonizers, Hindus and Muslims in India. There had been similar dynamics. Well, we've seen, for example, in Indochina, the French had to cope with similar things. In any case, in some, like in this case, for example, like they had created irreconcilable divisions. As Japan's imperial army had advanced toward India's borders, the Indian National Congress, that was a multi-faith organization but predominantly Hindu, led by Mohandas Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, initiated the so-called Quit India movement, where in August of 1942, right? So not even the end of 1942. So a moment in which the war itself seemed pretty, and would be in fact pretty much in its most heated moment and more sort of imbalanced one. We made a video about the rate of the ebb, by the way, that intersects with this, in fact, also temporal. So this political campaign rejected, and this was incredibly critical exactly in that moment, any military cooperation with Britain until Indian independence was achieved. It's a very important blackmail, denouncing at the same time, so putting essentially on the same level British imperialism and Nazism, right, which naturally was not quite the same thing. A notable Hindu Congress member, Subhas Chandra Bose, openly sided even with the Axis, Germany, Japan, seeking the colonizers' defeat and commanding military units against the same British, which in a broader political and strategic sense, given the purpose, made sense because, the British were threatened by the Germans at that point in Europe, and I also made a video about the U-boats if you're interested in that broader, also naval perspective that maritime-wise was also what kept, of course, through the Royal Navy, the British Empire together. The same is even truer also given the geographical proximity with the Japanese Empire at that point, right? The Japanese tried to enter, in fact, the British-controlled territories of India, and many Indians fought against the Japanese as well. So there was, just like today, when you look at people self-sabotaging, like it was never like, I don't know, in World War II, everybody was univocally from one side or another. I mean, there was plenty of fascists, notoriously, in Britain, even in the royal court, or in the United States, among sort of common people. There were always the guys, why do we have to be at war with this guy? He didn't do anything to us, or, we don't want to pay taxes for paying for weapons and all that kind of BS that it of course gets bypassed because it has no substance whatsoever. Today it is still propaganda, but at least the aim is technically something else. Bowser's position is particularly interesting in this philo-axis direction. Bowser had a proper force on its own, not even a small one. The so-called Indian National Army, INA, was in fact 43,000 strong by 1944. It comprised Indian prisoners of wars and Southeast Asian expatriates equipped with Japanese Type 38 rifles, Type 99 light machine guns. So literally probably the face of the enemy, if not for the fact they were literal Indians themselves. And operating under the principle of attacking where the enemy is unprepared, Bowser aimed to invade the same India via Burma, which is in fact where that intense fight with the Indo-British forces and Japanese happened, because there were Indians from the side of the Japanese too. So literally, you understood that this was a formation commanded by the Japanese, also enlisting Indian prisoners of war that maybe had not had defected exactly because they preferred to sabotage the British rather than fighting for them. This Axis force basically targeted Imphal and Kohima in 1944. The campaign collapsed against Allied defenses, though. Now we can't simply digress on the strategic context that naturally is very secondary, but politically it was very important for Indian affairs. There were 53,000 Japanese and INA casualties against 17,000 Allied losses, which is not even a few, right? This, in hindsight, can be attributed as an outcome to the overextended supply lines of the Japanese, the monsoonal terrain that did not really help. Logistics is important. It was mostly like a wrong strategic idea, but one that could have made at least leverage on some broader political option that was worth trying. Though defeated, the INA's actions, publicized widely, inflamed anti-British sentiment. In fact, regardless of the British victory, and also later in the war, this outcome actually worried the Indians that had hoped, in part, to say, okay, well, let's hope the British actually lose the war, right? And when they saw that this did not happen, they rose up. In fact, we count 20,000 desertions from the British Indian Army by 1945, fracturing colonial cohesion and widening Indo-Islamic divides at the same time. Never forget this. Why? Because the Islamic League's pro-British stance clashed with the Congress militancy, hastening the path to partition. And the Muslims had good reason to take that position because, of course, the Hindus were more, and they knew that if India had gained independence without British control, as it eventually happened, or at least it was limited to that disastrous effect, they would have had the worst of that, just from a demographic point of view. And so, even though they didn't like, as Muslim Indians, the British either in general terms, they stuck to them because they saw them as largely the ones who could protect them in that specific moment. This is also why, also in a broader political, long-sightedness, the Islamic League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah's leadership, and despite its affiliation with the Congress, viewed raising the independence issue during a global war as reckless and fully backed Britain's war efforts, deferring the question of Indian independence until after the war, at least. As you know, Jinnah is essentially the architect of Pakistan. Like Gandhi and Nehru, was a lawyer, by the way, and the most westernized of the trio, which is also quite interesting in historical perspective. Like you would see, like especially today, from a conservative perspective, you would think that Islam is just always the main threat of the West. But historically speaking, at least in different times and contexts, you would find of course, opportunistically and instrumentally, the Muslims to be the best interlocutors of the West. In this case, as we'll explain also why, but even as far as the Westernization is concerned, as you know, also Gandhi, has his photos in British tie and suit and so on. But let's say was truly the most Westernized. Jinnah had been educated in Britain. He donned himself and better finely tailored London suits and flawless silk ties, regularly enjoyed whiskey, by the way, and meaningfully enough, was seldom seen in a mosque as well. This is also very interesting because it tells you that a certain process of modernization and secularization within, like a British and so also a Christian control, like was coveted by some of these Muslims even. And that's something you should have asked him in particular. Like I'm sure that there are lots of books written on this, but let's say it's for today at least out of our scope. Jinnah's reserved and strategic demeanor did not deter him from confronting a scandal that nearly ostracized him from his community. In fact, at age 40, he fell in love with and wed a 16-year-old girl, the daughter of a prosperous Parsi industrialist of Zoroastrian faith. Right? This is also incredibly interesting as far as cross-cultural and religious issues is concerned. Then, of course, you can't question about the age gap and the minority. But let's say this is also another story. Politically speaking, he was at least a pretty straightforward person. Opposed by both the bride's family and Muslims, and strained by their age gap, however, the marriage grew deeply unhappy, ending in divorce, meaning that, of course, something was not right there. Besides, and tragically, the young woman died at 29 years old from cancer, profoundly impacting Jinnah, that naturally saw in this some divine punishment and redirected his focus entirely to politics. And this is a very bitter, of course, and interesting course of affairs. The Islamic community of India reaped the benefits of Jinnah's abilities in this renewed elan, and he would later be revered in Pakistan, in fact, as the nation's founding father. From the mid-1930s, Jinnah emerged as the staunchest proponent of dividing India into two states and establishing Pakistan, because he feared essentially that otherwise the Islamic minority, it doesn't matter how big it was, would have, in fact, may have really gotten like a much worse deal. In fact, he himself had initially favored the notion of a unified independent state, right? His political experiences, however, bred a deep mistrust of Hindus and a conviction beyond mere apprehension that a united nation, in fact, would be controlled by the most uncompromising Hindu factions, relegating Muslims to a marginalized minority in an alien land. And just think this from like even just the leader's standpoint, right? And how you would have this responsibility for your co-religionaries on your shoulders, their blood on your hands. A staunch secularist, as he really was, he also clashed for this reason as sharply with Gandhi, right? Rejecting the latter's fusion of ethical religious ideals with politics and insisting on their strict separation. And this is also quite interesting. And by the way, Gandhi's figure is not so straightforwardly pacifistic as we intend. Like if Gandhi had had weapons, he would have actually used them, right? And so aside from the fact, of course, of what followed later in general during the partition, like again, the actual proportions and relations in what happened are not obvious, right, in terms of, again, which side was necessarily the most vicious. Jinnah fiercely opposed Satyagraha, that was Gandhi's force of truth, that's what it means, campaign of non-violent resistance, and his deliberate reference to Gandhi as, quote, Mr. Gandhi rather than Mahatma, great soul, which sounds very British, by the way, was seen by Hindus, in fact, as an outrageous affront, in as much as it also tended to reduce, to belittle, essentially, their spiritual principle in a way that sounded both Muslim and British at the same time. So that actually increased the hatred that was already felt towards the Islamic community. Meanwhile, in fact, the Hindu agenda was really clear. The most nationalist factions sought an India firmly grounded in its cultural and religious heritage, unwilling to make concessions. This is also something that can be seen as a, in historical perspective, as a great opportunity, right? It turned out to be for India. You have the upper hand demographically. You have, after all, a pretty old millenary tradition and identity. The Muslim element is seen as an external accident, not better than the British one, and one that had essentially controlled and oppressed the Hindus for centuries, almost a millennium. So this is clear, especially like if you fuel on embers, like the masses will amplify this fire to that the Holocaust that would turn out to be. Even Gandhi faced their enduring enmity when, in a last-ditch effort to win Jinnah's support for a unified state, he suggested to British negotiators that Jinnah be named Prime Minister of the new nation. In other words, the same Gandhi understood, look, if here we are to make a united India and things go, in fact, down that line, there's going to be a bloodshed. So if we're going to if we're trying to save the system from much worse damage, let's actually cooperate, and let's even show that Jinnah is somehow a credible interlocutor and that there is a chance for the Hindus and the Muslims to have some kind of cooperation. Now, on January the 30th, 1948, Gandhi paid, however, the ultimate price for his vision of a peaceful and today leftists would say inclusive India, because, as you know, he was assassinated by a same Hindu nationalist that deemed him to be, in fact, too lenient towards Muslims, and that therefore was preferable. It is after this big dramatic event that threatened to engulf the entire system, like in that very moment, into what would have eventually happened anyway, that Mountbatten stepped in. On February the 20th, 1947, Clement Attlee's Labour government named Admiral Louis Mountbatten, as lesser royal, as Viceroy of India, charging him with securing the country's independence by June of the following year. So, essentially managing to bail out with the least possible damage, and obviously and hopefully with the best solution, given that what was brewing in the Indian cauldron was nothing but trouble that risked to explode and was already essentially starting to escalate. Britain hoped naturally to preserve India's unity for strategic purposes, including like a continuity in sort of British, say, control to some extent at least, with a formidable allied army in the region amid the approaching Cold War. This is very interesting in historical perspective because, as you know, India was very much sheltered also by other big empires, had resisted the Mongol invasion, etc. So there was something about especially the Soviet Union's ambitions and any other communist escalation. I mean, China was, as you know, in also pretty evolving, in a pretty evolving situation to stem, like as a giant, like providing this critical mass to sort of hold, especially the spread of communism, which in this sense was at least something achievable with India, even as an independent country. At that point, such considerations were, however, secondary, as the most critical issue at the moment was urgency, right? Escalating riots and massacres were already starting to engulf the subcontinent, and the British military could no longer quell them or maintain order. Gandhi had truly, up to that point, been like the wedge, that cornerstone, could keep things together, also with this sort of attentively appeasing policy with the Muslims, but he was taken out exactly for that reason, so proving how furiously mounting the tide really was. Mountbatten, who commanded 1.2 million Allied troops in Southeast Asia during the war, inherited a British Indian army reduced to 390,000 by 1947, with, as we've seen, 40% of its unit immobilized by communal distrust, Islamic soldiers clashing with Hindu and Sikh comrades. So these are, hundreds of thousands of men in arms, right, that are starting really to take matters in their own hand. This, of course, undermined the unity of command of the viceroy in this situation, facing 15,000 weekly deaths from riots. At that point, Mountbatten's 14,000 British European troops lacked the mobility. Only 200 armored vehicles remained, by the way, which for the Indian subcontinent at large, as you understand, is not really enough to enforce order, in fact, across a space that counted 3.5 million square miles. Britain's £2 billion war debt and 1946 GDP contraction of 4.2% forced a rapid exit. Right? Things were getting pretty bad in Britain, at home, in the very heart of their people. And so this brought a certain haste which violates the principle of deliberate planning, resulting in a rushed partition that left borders undefined and violence unchecked, cementing the subcontinent's division. Mountbatten promptly engaged with leaders of both sides through his charisma and authority, But all promises and assurances offered to Jinnah for a united India were met with unwavering refusal from the other side. The Islamic minority had legitimate concerns, as we've seen. The proposed frameworks envisioned a centralized unitary state, while they would have accepted a federal structure only with substantial regional autonomy instead. Jinnah's unyielding stance, which tactically overstated his true aims, emboldened Islamic extremists to intensify violence, a bit like it had happened for Gandhi, turning India into a tinderbox. Confronted with an intractable dilemma and unable to determine whether Jinnah's resolute position was a genuine or a negotiating ploy, Mountbatten opted to resolve this issue by granting Muslims their demand, a separate state. Thus, the partition was accelerated to midnight between August the 14th and 15th, 1947, despite unresolved disputes over the borders of the two new nations. Right, Jawaharlal Nehru, the Hindu negotiator, at that point, after Gandhi had dismissed the notion of a federal state, and alongside other key Congress figures, was guiding Hindus towards accepting the partition. Nehru was particularly troubled by the nearly 600 princely states still present in India, right, whose autonomy in a federal system would have undermined centralized authority. Think how actually traditional also British India had remained. Gandhi had stood alone in championing a united India, increasingly sidelining with the Congress. But the idea probably of a private princely state, like unlike you could see in Europe, especially after 1918, is something incredibly romantic, and especially something much more also less romantically primitive and sort of wild, like you could imagine in certain corners of the subcontinent. At least in Europe, I don't think we ever properly even pictured not even from a geographical point of view, but we're there, we're surviving as a medieval legacy, and that seemed, in that sense, to also to pose a threat, as you understand here, from the more sort of hopefully performing standpoint of an independent, united country. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, tasked with delineating the borders of the two states, like so the Hindu and the Islamic one, adopted a straightforward approach to partitioning the territory. The 1941 census recorded 94.5 million Muslims and 270.2 million Hindus in the subcontinent. So respectively 24.3 and 69% of the population. There were other religious groups, but they did not exceed 3%, so they could be considered also as irrelevant. In the bigger picture, the partition was in this way viable only because the concentrated distribution of the Muslims, at least in part, as we've seen. In fact, had the 94 million Muslims been evenly spread, making up about like 1/5 of each district and province, say, they would have lacked the leverage to demand themselves a separate state, rendering, just by the principle of concentration of forces, a Muslim nation in the subcontinent unfeasible, right? Which is paradoxical, because likely it would have been also a much greater, slower, but an easier one for the Hindus to carry out. Instead, at least the Islamic population was densely clustered in a few provinces. India had 435 districts, of which 76 were of Islamic majority. We're talking about like a 17% of all districts, but roughly encompassing 60% of the whole Islamic population of India. So of these districts, 50 out of 76 had populations over 3/4 Muslim, so they were quite densely Islamic. Had these districts been dispersed across the country, they would have lacked, as we've seen, the cohesion to assert national aspirations. So this was also relatively random and already a product of some sort of segregation or separation of different religious groups in different parts of the country throughout the centuries. To say also how pressing the political problem was for the British, I don't understand if you understand the implication of what I just said, because if you consider that something like 1-2 million died in this, right? It's just because of the relative lack of the fact that these 76 Islamic, so-called Islamic, because there were also Hindus there, districts were adjacent and concentrated into regions, right? One in the northwest and one in the northeast, which means that these were also the bulk of Pakistan and Bangladesh, as it would be outlined, right? So those 1-2 million dead mostly stemmed out of the minority, substantial, say, but still very minority of the Hindus that existed in this 76 so-called Islamic districts, and the much more exposed Islamic and very minority in the rest of the so-called Hindu ones, right? So all those dead happened on a relative, let's say, with relatively few people who had to move, right? If Hindus and Muslims had been more evenly spread across India, we would have easily counted in the tens of millions of people slaughtered, all right? And this was also something that, of course, reflected in turn this greater enmity, because probably if historically that evenly spread had occurred, probably like also the Indo-Islamic relations would have been very different from a cultural and political point of view. But this may have actually even enhanced the hatred towards that minority, in considering how these religious groups were spread in districts. So no Islamic majority district existed, by the way, outside the two areas populated mostly by Muslims, and neither included a Hindu majority district at the same time, which seemed like sort of to be making sense. Thus, despite the 1,700 kilometers of future Indian territory separating Pakistan and Bangladesh, these regions provided the demographic and geographic basis for both. Right, Radcliffe's border delineation for Pakistan followed these Islamic majority zones, a compromise that left all parties dissatisfied as well. And that's why at the beginning I said that this was also a relatively, hastened thing, and that possibly even just the Bengal part was sort of even much less straightforward than we think. Punjab and Bengal, in fact, were split during a partition within the partition, while Kashmir's status in the northwest remained unresolved, as you see still today, as it's contended between Hindus and Muslims, in other words, now Indians and Pakistanis. Incredibly important, considering, again, this day's events and the forever war that has been fought ever since over those lands in particular. They're also, as we were saying before, very strategical, because that was exactly the juncture of so much that was going on there. Consider what would happen later historically, I don't know, with Soviet invasion of Pakistan, with nuclear weapons being provided to both countries. The wars were fought there, but also the ones with the surrounding. Think about Iran from the other side, think about China, also from the opposite one. And so a plethora of issues that I will not be commenting on this specific occasion. If not for the fact that the wounds of the Indian partition persist, right? Irreparably fracturing relations between the two countries that resulted out of the division. So in a sense, sibling nations, because regardless of their characterization, they literally emerged from the same birth, right? And that turned, however, adversaries, scarred by multiple wars that have fueled ongoing hatred and bitterness, as we've seen just in the last days. People killed. So after the partition, two fates had coexisted for centuries within an incredible and unique system like only India could be, despite underlying tensions, now were divided, engaging in mutual and extreme ethnic cleansing, with no resolution to this enmity inside. And for reasons that go arguably far, in fact, beyond the dead themselves, but this constant sort of almost Freudian issue with what was yours and who were you and who are these guys from the other side and what kind of blood do you have in your veins and what kind of identity you have. It's incredibly complicated and entangled that without mentioning that these countries are not just role models for the world, like in different ways, and aside from again their importance, their objective importance are a source of concern even to this day is like a quite important ambiguity, mostly withdrawn from the side of India because of economical ties with the West. The Pakistanis essentially not being able to control their own country, with needing to go kill Bin Laden by intruding in their own territory, and like at the border with Afghanistan, lots of pretty shady things happening, just to mention a few, besides the same toxic relation between one another to begin with. And so the most recent surge of tension, etc., before 2025 had been, if I'm not wrong properly, the one of 2019, at least in February that year, that in the disputed Kashmir region, of which, again, like the beauty of it, like many photos of British expeditions, etc., like from the last century, really projecting in a completely different reality, and make you realize how sort of new and obviously the consequence of this major dynamic. For example, the same attack carried out as a trigger for the 2019 crisis by an Islamic separatist group, followed by Indian counterattacks and Pakistani responses in turn, is just part of a big unsolved issue, right? And untangled knot. And the brutality of it is also quite characteristic. On February the 14th of 2019, we could talk about what happened today. Like if you look at the tweets, etc., like how many people died where, etc., like pretty bloody encounters. But 6 years ago, Jaish-e-Mohammed's suicide bombing in Pulwama killed 40 Indian Central Reserve Police Force personnel. Right, this crisis this year was ignited by probably the killing of some Indian tourists in the region. And it's not like India doesn't have beefs, let's say, with China. Once in a while they throw each other stones, somebody dies. Like, it's so funny in so many ways. Seriously, I mean, it's just ridiculous to tell you all. But in 2019, you had India's Operation Bandar with 12 Mirage 2000 jets dropping 1,000 kilos laser-guided bombs on a military camp in Balakot, Pakistan. That was on February 26, claiming 300 military deaths, disputed by Pakistan, by the way. And Pakistan's retaliatory airstrike arrived the day after, using 24 JF-17 and F-16 jets, downing an Indian MiG-21, capturing the pilot Abhinadan Vartam, by the way, who was released the following week. So here there is a violation of, let's say, a sane principle is avoiding escalation, at least without clear objectives, which is exactly what we've seen. I mean, you may never know what's behind the scenes because it's not like journalists are told the stuff, and there are all the political reasons of the case that you can imagine behind these shady deals also in countries that we understand culturally up to a certain point. But the main problem is the bomb. I mean, both nations risked, as always, if anything, because they are equipped with them, not quite in any concrete way. Like also this year, yes, they talk about nuclear confrontation, but they're just, threatening that, but as always, not using it because it doesn't make any sense. It's completely disproportionate, and nobody would win out of that. We're talking, if I'm not wrong, India I think has 140 warheads, Pakistan 170. Of course, these were calibrated on exactly in order to stabilize the system. And since the beginning, also because the Allies already had that, as you know, at the time. This was the same, still rooted in Kashmir unresolved status since 1947, which exposed the region's role, of course, as a nuclear flashpoint with, by the way, at least up to this year's crisis, I think something like 1,200 militant attacked in Jammu and Kashmir, at least over the previous decade or something, resulting in 3,500 dead, right? So not a few, after all. So there is all a history in between that is very interesting, and at some point we will cover these wars as well. Beyond numerous smaller clashes, in fact, the two nations have fought 4 major wars. The first, Kashmir one, exactly in 1947-48. That saw India seize 2/3 of Kashmir. That was, let's remember, an Islamic majority province, leaving Pakistan with the remaining third. And I did understand there is also a blend of very old bloods, such as the Pashtun ethnicity, that is Islamic but Iranian. In October of 1947, in fact, 5,000 Pakistan-backed Pashtun tribesmen armed with Lee Enfield rifles, by the way, and we'll talk about also the wars in Afghanistan, the many wars in Afghanistan also between the British, the Russians at the beginning, but say even more during the Middle Ages, and yet again invaded Kashmir to seize the princely state before its accession. India's airlift of 1,000 troops from the 1st Sikh Regiment to Srinagar using 12 Dakota aircraft secured the valley after Maharaja Hari Singh's October the 26th accession. Fought across, by the way, 7,000-foot altitudes, the war saw 1,500 Indian and 2,000 Pakistani casualties, with India's 77th Parachute Brigade leveraging terrain to securing the high ground. The January 1949 UN ceasefire established the 740 kilometers long line of control, but dividing a 70% Islamic region-fueled insurgency with 15,000 militant recruits by 1950, embedding Kashmir as a partition-born war zone. Then you have the Second Kashmir War in 1965, rekindling war in the region. However, UN-mandated ceasefire after 2 months left the status quo intact. Pakistan's Operation Gibraltar deployed 7,000 Mujahideen to incite rebellion in Kashmir, underestimating India's 180,000 troop Northern Command, by the way. India's counteroffensive using 600 Centurion tanks and 200 AMX-13s captured the Hajipir Pass, exploiting the decisive engagement principle. The war's 3,000 Indian and 38,000 Pakistani deaths, including 1,200 in the tank-heavy Battle of Chawinda, achieved no territorial gains, as the September 23 Tashkent Agreement restored the line of control. Think about even these spaces, how much we talk Tashkent and medieval intercontinental trade routes, just namely. But if you look at the disproportion, for example, of just several thousand guerrilla troops against like an entire Indian Northern Command of hundreds of thousands, right? And the ultimate outcome, which is essentially a draw, multiple thousand dead from both sides, plus all imagine like the wounded, the sort of the memories shared. So like how much would keep on sedimenting the notion that it was possible to make something out there, even just a sort of showdown, but feeling as a playground almost, which is something that as you know, India and Pakistan almost re-evoke ritually at their borders with their military exchange, military salute, right, and the ceremony, which is very interesting because it sort of shows again the faces of peoples are pretty similar, or at least that group like still maintained the awareness of having emerged as states, at least from the same matrix, and that really confide to one another the deepest, sort of wildest, the third element almost of the Clausewitzian Trinity to one another, but still with some kind of form of effective ritualized respect and some, highly solemn fashion, quite, choreographed, quite consuetudinary one, as if to say, like, this war is really forever, and we acknowledge that, right? The failure to disrupt Kashmir's status, rooted in Radcliffe's 1947 borders, entrenched, by the way, mutual accusations of aggression very easily, like with Pakistan's 1966 defense budget rising of 1/5 to $450 million, signaling the partition of India's lasting militarization. The most severe war arose in 1971 when Pakistan's military launched a campaign to crush Bengali separatists in eastern Pakistan. Interestingly enough, the separatists had perpetuated ethnic cleansing against local Muslims, killing hundreds of thousands, but Pakistan's response was genocidal as well, with 500,000 Bengalis brutally killed and 10 million fleeing to India. All right. Pakistan's Operation Searchlight, launched March 25th, 1971, deployed 40,000 troops with M24 Shafi tanks and F-86 Sabres, targeting 15,000 Awami League supporters in Dhaka, killing 7,000 in one night only. It was a Turkish shoot, really. And the Mahdi Bahini's 100,000 guerrillas using captured Type 56 rifles disrupted Pakistan's 80,000 strong Eastern Command, embodying a masterful guerrilla strategy. The 10 million refugees strained India's $2.1 billion 1971 budget, prompting Indira Gandhi's intervention. The war, expertly directed by General Sam Manekshaw, lasted just 13 days, from December the 3rd to 16th, 1971, culminating in Pakistan's total defeat and the birth of Bangladesh in the process. Because up to that point, like, the two chunks were ideally thought to be simply like manageable like that. It wasn't like a good idea. And in fact, here the cord was too much strain, it broke. India's 600,000 troops, 850 T-55 tanks, and the INS Vikrant Siog strikes achieved a 15-to-1 kill ratio. So showing an overwhelming superiority, forcing 93,000 Pakistani surrenders, the largest in a war since 1945. The Simla Agreement formalized Bangladesh's independence, but Pakistan's $1.2 billion military loss and India's $3 billion campaign cost entrenched a rivalry born of Partition's divisive borders, with Bangladesh's 1972 army of 50,000 signaling new regional tensions. Kashmir saw renewed fighting in 1999 during the Kargil War. I don't know if you remember that as a kid, named for the district where battles occurred. In fact, Pakistan's army, having infiltrated and seized strategic positions, was driven back after nearly 3 months of fierce combat. Pakistan's Northern Light Infantry, 5,000 troops with 81mm mortars, occupied 132 posts across 16,000-foot peaks, and these are very difficult to dislodge, aiming to sever India's NH1 highway per art of war's choke point strategy. India's Operation Vijay, mobilizing 200,000 troops, 300 Bofors FH-77B guns, and 24 Mirage 2000 sorties, retook Tiger Hill by July the 4th, anyway, with 527 Indian and 700 Pakistani deaths. Right, you understand from these engagements that, of course, like everything is calibrated also to terrains, to the sort of this limited approach that also was due to obvious practicality, the pragmatic concerns regarding especially the costs, right? Because the war of 1991 cost India $2 billion and Pakistan's almost 1/3 of the defense budget, hiking to $3 billion, right? This gives you an idea of how costly at all. Even these, this is strategically irrelevant, but also, as we've seen, relatively limited engagements that show you how even a major war is sort of difficult in certain areas. It really depends where it's fought. On July the 26th, 1991, you had the line of control restoration under U.S. pressure at that point, leaving 4,000 annual ceasefire violations anyway, perpetuating Kashmir as a militarized legacy of 1947's unresolved borders. I'm very glad to make this kind of videos because they highlight, let's say, the fundamentals, at least, of what we're eventually going to strengthen with more dedicated videos. As you know, I'm expanding a bit more in 20th century history and in general let's say also what's behind that politically, because at the end of the day you can't even like combat to an important degree of the technicality, etc. We also talk about weapons and their history, etc. But at the same time, what truly matters is understanding the world we live in, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do to an extent, especially if you haven't properly lived through these things, you haven't studied them adequately, and generally speaking, you have said, okay, well, but I'm from the other side of the world, why should I even care, right? Which is, unfortunately, sort of like, it's understandable. I subscribe to that too in part, but of course it's never, just because there are sort of course, more pressing issues closer at hand, or just more important issues to begin with. It's not like these do not exist or they do not count, right? Important is also sort of also getting them right, and also thinking about the different avenues that history takes, sometimes for the better, sometimes for worse, but still with, I would say, a confidence of the fact that there is, and this studying the thing in Clausewitzian terms, always some sort of reality check in terms of political motivation that brings you to, let's say, to find solutions rather than perpetual states of war. Now, India and Pakistan have this experience instead more preferred than other countries, but it's not really quite, say, rare from one side, but it's also not quite the same extensive thing it could have ever been, even considering the two nuclear arsenals. It's also something that could and would cause bigger problems when You would say we give weapons to this country. Well, let's say, yeah, because we have the means to control that, and even when, say, you get to the point in which you can't control that, because much bigger problems have also been enacted evidently by the actor who behaves like that. So it's always all very, history is, it's so much sort of multiple levels than one normally thinks, right? It's very easy and seductive, so to say, to presume that there is an easy answer, or at least a simple one to the scene. Like the main problem is not what is actually going on, but how you explain it to people who do not know that, right? That's historically speaking, even just out of experience, is one of the most difficult aspects of the war. And by the way, I wouldn't make this videos if I didn't think that there could be some practical utility. Naturally, for a channel like mine that has never covered such topic, has just made videos. Well, I've made videos about Indian history, but mostly, again, the Mughal, the Maurya's at some point. But it's all novel to start talking this specific story. But we try also, because really we have to pass through it at some point, so it's better now than in another moment. Admittedly, there was one of you commenting the other day, and I remember saying that Schwerpunkt covers so many different scattered topics, so to disperse it, right? It's actually part of the same one, if you understand that I study the art of war, right? So this proves, unfortunately, that people watch my content for the wrong reason, right? They essentially assume it's mostly a nationalistic issue. They don't understand what I'm doing by the slightest very often. And this is very interesting, because some followers also are here from years, but sometimes they come up with the statements. You say, okay, so they get basically everything I do. They listen to me all the time, but they do not grasp that it's not much about this or that the whole point is, but how you analyze war, even just methodologically, sometimes even dialectically. Because how do you even start talking about warfare? Telling the truth, it's not easy, it's not simple, it's not something you can immediately reconcile with, unless you have some specific, say, interesting or immersion in such topics, which is something that in part we are carrying out throughout the same channel, and that is otherwise a bit difficult to do, and takes time, takes patience, etc. It's not easy at all, but we try, as I say. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.